Many of the issues surrounding long-distance trade surfaced in the first 2 decades of the operation of what was the largest publicly owned company of the exploration age, the Dutch East India Company. Originally, the firm had been founded in 1599 as a regulated company, a collection of individual merchants, much like a guild. But in 1602, the firm was reorganized and public participation was invited, allowing members of the household sector to supply capital to the firm and to share in the profits that it would generate. This, of course, gave them a much larger capital base than they would have had otherwise, enabling the relatively small Dutch Republic to channel a huge amount of resources into this new national enterprise. In fact, they were so successful at raising capital that they ended up with as much as 8 times the level of capital that the British East India Company, founded around the same time, raised. Comparatively, the British East India Company had roughly 260 owners who originally provided the capital for the firm. Comparatively speaking, the Dutch East India Company had over 10,000 investors supplying capital to the firm within just the first 6 months. And this meant that because profit participation was widespread across the entire country, that the gains from trade were widespread as well. And this contributed to what was called the Dutch Golden Age period, in which the Dutch became one of the wealthiest societies on earth on a per capita basis. And not merely because there were particularly wealthy royals, for instance, as was the case in France at the time. Instead, this was very widespread wealth throughout society that further catalyzed entrepreneurial ventures. Now, in the first decade after their operations began, the share capital of the VoC was made permanent, meaning that if investors wanted to cash out of the firm, they would have to sell their shares to some other investor because capital was simply not going to be returned to them. The original charter had estimated that the firm would have been wound up after 20 years in 1622, but the firm had invested substantial amounts of capital into long-term illiquid assets, the value of which would have been substantially reduced by the liquidation process, and therefore was deemed to be against the public's interest. So instead, the firm was converted into a permanent capital organization, and trading in its shares took on a very important life, as we'll see during our next lesson regarding the stock market. Now, this access to locked-in capital allowed the firm to set up large-scale local operations, because as it turns out, most of the Dutch East India Company's profits were not derived by transporting European goods to Asia and then transporting Asian goods to Europe. Instead, they were derived from a triangular trade facilitating exchange between different Asian countries, the profits of which were then invested into high-value goods to be exported to Europe. But primarily, the Dutch East India Company's profits were derived from purchasing Japanese copper, which was then sailed to India in the Bay of Bengal and traded for textiles like silks, which were in turn traded in Vietnam and Siam for spices and dyes, which then went to Japan to buy more copper. And this long-term triangular trade continued between countries for some time, as the Europeans effectively inserted themselves into a trade system which otherwise had been far less efficient. Now, unfortunately for investors, there were some real challenges associated with this, because in the first decade of operation, while the firm may have been trying to establish itself in the Indian Ocean basin, it also ended up deriving the majority of its profits from piracy, which is to say, robbing their English competitors in their efforts to try to control the territory. This was certainly a business that many investors did not quite approve of, but this was only the tip of the iceberg, quite frankly. In the Banda Islands, the Dutch East India Company is estimated to have killed anywhere from 15 to 25,000 people, depopulating the Spice Islands only to have them become re-inhabited by slave labor, which was imported to extract these spices. So there were clearly some problems with what the company was doing, far away from what could be observed by their shareholders. In fact, the VoC is the organization that brought us the modern form of torture and waterboarding, which had been used to keep its own employees in check, given the possibilities that they might simply operate for their own benefit when they could not be directly supervised. Here's an example of the kind of attitude the firm's managers actually had. This is a quote from Jan Pieterszoon, who you see in the top right-hand corner here, the chief executive of the Dutch East India Company in the East Indies, reporting to the Dutch board of the VoC back home in 1614. He says, "Your honors know by experience that trade in Asia must be driven and maintained under the protection and favor of your honors' own weapons, and that the weapons must be paid for by the profits from trade, so that we cannot carry on trade without war, nor war without trade." Needless to say, while some of the internal managers or directors might have been willing to accept this line, the public shareholders found it less than convincing. They were much more interested in financing actual trade and would have rather left the waging of wars or unofficial corporate wars to states themselves as opposed to corporations. Now, in addition to these problems beyond the horizon, there were issues a little bit closer to home as well. For instance, the VoC's local managers had set up a series of shell companies whereby they could sell imported spices from the Indian Ocean basin and Indonesia to their own local firms, who would then mark it up to full market price to sell to the public. In this way, they effectively tunneled out anywhere from 90 to 95% of the profits that shareholders would have originally expected to earn, but were instead used to line the pockets of management. Now, as these kinds of issues piled up and as news managed to trickle out of the firm into the minds of the public, people began public leafleting campaigns against the company and direct appeals to the government to either reform its practices or to take the company down. Ultimately, management of the firm was forced to concede to the owners and investors in the company and negotiated improvements in corporate governance that ultimately satisfied these investors. So the major changes occurred in 1622 when the firm's original charter was set to expire. The new charter, as mentioned earlier, made its capital permanent, but also indicated several new changes into how the organization would be run and to how information would flow between owners and managers. The shareholders in 1622, for instance, gained the right to select 9 members from amongst themselves who at least owned 1% share of the company, who would be allowed to attend the VoC's corporate board meetings and would be able to consult with management on significant issues. They were not allowed to vote at these meetings, however, but they could raise concerns and they could carry information that was not deemed to be particularly sensitive back to other investors. The 9, or the Council of 9 Lords, also had the right to inspect the company's warehouses, inspect their purchasing records, and to appoint an auditor each year in order to verify the reported results. Another signal that was provided for investors of the company's relative health was the establishment of a stable annual dividend. This forced managers to make sure that they were earning sufficient profits in order to be able to pay investors a more comfortable return. Over the following 30 years after the charter changes, so taking us all the way up to 1652, we see that the total amount of returned capital to investors averaged 6.7% every year, a mix of cash and payment in kind in the form of spices. But this doesn't even account for reinvested capital that was plowed into expanding the firm's asset base. And needless to say, the establishment of this stable dividend ensured that investors knew that they had, in fact, invested into productive assets that would earn an appropriate yield for them. It's questionable whether or not the firm would have ever survived had it not been for these kinds of changes. And in fact, we see these kinds of changes echoed in modern corporate finance. We see the presence of both corporate boards of directors appointed by shareholders who are to operate the firm in the interest of the organization's stakeholders. We see activist investors who are holding directors and managers to account by mobilizing shareholders to change up the composition of the board. We also see that modern corporate finance has continued with the notion of financial disclosure by requiring firms to submit annual reports as well as quarterly statements in Canada and the US. They're also required to disclose any kind of new material information to all investors simultaneously and thus try to reduce the costs that the firm incurs associated with information asymmetries. Finally, modern corporate finance comes courtesy of Jensen, informs us that there is a disciplining aspect to regular dividend payments that requires managers to ensure that they have invested into projects which will generate the cash flows necessary to sustain these kinds of payments to investors. Nonetheless, despite these improvements in corporate governance, we find that many corporations that are acting beyond effective supervision often get left to their own affairs. Usually, this type of thing is only interrupted once a particularly aggrieved party is able to motivate their home government to try to rein them in, or perhaps the shareholders themselves become sufficiently enraged, as was the case of the Dutch East India Company. But nonetheless, over the hundreds of years which followed, we noticed that firms who were able to operate beyond the writ of effective supervision continued to do whatever they wanted in pursuit of profit. In many cases, they simply informed their shareholders that everything was good, many profits were being made, and that the natives were friendly and handing over wealth. We see this, for instance, in the case of the Royal Africa Company. The Royal Africa Company of the late 1600s, early 1700s, was notorious for capturing, trying in their own courts, and imprisoning in their own prison people they referred to as interlopers, who were attempting to violate the 1,000-year monopoly that the British king had granted to his cousin's company over all trade with the African continent. A little bit closer to home, the Hudson Bay Company, established in the 1670s, was given full feudal rights effectively to roughly 1/3 of modern Canada. The Hudson Bay Company blocked any type of trade that it did not directly control, robbed and imprisoned settlers that it accused of violating its laws, and shot to kill at trespassers who attempted to compete on their lands. It's worth noting for history buffs that the Hudson Bay Company grant was actually given illegally by the English crown because England did not control this territory at the time. And therefore, there is no legal grounds whatsoever for assigning it, aside from the spurious claim that the watershed of Hudson Bay was in fact terra nullius, or no one's land. Certainly, the Cree inhabitants of the Hudson Bay watershed would have begged to differ, and certainly Imperial France, with its holdings that included some of that territory, would have disputed such claims as well. Nonetheless, the Hudson Bay Company continued to administer its territories as though it was a feudal lord until it was forced to surrender its territories to the Dominion Government of Canada after a parliamentary select committee in 1857 exposed the company's crimes to its shareholders after almost 200 years of running rampant across the watershed. Lest we believe that these problems have disappeared in the modern world, just 120 years ago, 130 years ago, the Abyr Congo Company was involved in taking hostages who died. They used starvation as a weapon against lazy natives of the Congo who wouldn't supply them with enough rubber. They forced thousands of people into labor camps and committed hundreds of directly attributable murders before the King of Belgium was finally sufficiently embarrassed as to revoke their license. It's worth noting that the King of Belgium also had his private territories of the Belgian Congo stripped from him by the Belgian Parliament as the atrocities taking place there became revealed to the public. Moving back to North America, however, we find the United Fruit Company performing not much better in Central America. In both 1911 and 1954, it was directly or indirectly involved in two separate coups, and it helped to arrange for the 1928 Banana Massacre in Colombia, in which hundreds, perhaps thousands of people were executed in a public square under the authority of the military, who claimed they were doing United Fruit's dirty work. Needless to say, these sorts of problems do continue, and it's important for shareholders to keep a close eye on what is being done effectively in their name with their resources. A lot of companies will continue to operate as though they won't be held to account, and it is important for us, if we hope to have our resources allocated in a way that we want them to be allocated, that we try to hold these kinds of firms to account when they violate their agreements with us and when they conduct themselves in a way that we find unacceptable.